The Carpe Diem String Quartet is a boundary breaking ensemble whose mission is to forge a new identity for chamber music by championing living composers, undertaking daring projects with other art forms, and promoting the healing power of music. They've earned widespread acclaim for their performances of standard repertoire, new music, genre bending collaborations, and community engagement. Carpe Diem defies classification with programming and collaborations that encompass and blend new and old, including classical, Romani, tango, folk, pop, rock, jazz, and multicultural music. Their outreach performances, including MusiCare, Music Goes to School, and Music from the Start, incorporate diverse and eclectic repertoire tailored to specific audience demographics, bringing their inspiring performances and outreach to diverse audiences such as the Apache Nation, to families at the Columbus Museum of Art, and residents at the Ohio Women's Reformatory. I'm excited to be joined by Carpe Diem members Charles Wetherbee and Korine Fujiwara. To start, I'd like to ask you, a string quartet is not only an ensemble, it's a family, a business, a way of life. Can you talk about your individual and unique roles at Carpe Diem?
Oh, wow. I'll take a stab at that first. So Korine and I are both we are the two founders of the quartet back in
Nice.
2004, actually 2005, and we've had some wonderful collaborators. Unfortunately, as sometimes happens in quartets, sometimes for a lot of life reasons, you're not able to stay together, but you find new people to work with. So what are our roles? I mean, your role is kind of everything in a quartet. You're playing music first and foremost. You're thinking about programming. You're kind of, Korine and I over the years have kind of been the executive directors of the organization in a sense. We sometimes have to feel like we're grant writers. I mean, there's all these different aspects of trying to keep your mission alive, and it's not all just sitting down and playing, I guess. Yeah, I don't know, Korine.
I mean, development directors, box office managers, stage crew, light designer, sound designer, manager, cold caller, co-conspirator, and on the simple, I'm the violist and Chaz is the first violinist. And so the roles, they also kind of are flexible. Sometimes one of us has something big going on, and so other members will take up the slack. And fortunately, we have some wonderful colleagues, and everybody is willing to jump in full in, and it's a partnership, it's a family, it's a complex relationship based on respect and trust, and it's kind of intimate in the music making, so much like there's a mind meld that goes on sometimes. You know how people who've been in a relationship for a long time answer their partner's questions. It's like that, but 4 ways. It's very interesting. I don't think there's anything like it. It's a wonderful, complicated, complex relationship.
Yeah, and I'll just add, if it's all right, Devin. There are, when you use the word family initially in your question, there are quartets, at least that I've read about, that seem to be much more of a business. They come together to rehearse from 9 until noon or whatever it is, and they all need to meet in New York or LA or wherever it is. So they all arrive in the right city at the right time. But they take separate flights, they eat meals separately. They're not necessarily friends. I can't really imagine a quartet functioning that way. For us and our 2 other members, Marissa and Ariana, they are friends. The 4 of us, as Korine said, we do enjoy each other's company, and we do like to have meals together. We do sometimes finish each other's sentences. in a sense. But I I know that quartets can work in different ways. I'm really happy that ours works in this way.
Well, it definitely sounds like that from your recordings. Can you talk about the differences? You founded the group in 2005. Can you talk about the differences or unique challenges facing multidisciplinary ensembles who are sort of trying to bring not only classical music but all these different genres to new audiences? The differences in 2005 and 2019, and can you also maybe discuss what did COVID teach you as classical musicians and entrepreneurs that others who might be listening to the beginning of this podcast, who may not get to the end of the show, could learn from?
That's a lot of questions, a lot of information.
I
Difference
try to
between
pack them all in.
2005 to 2019 is like a million lifetimes in between those. In 2005, we were all living in the same state, all living in the same city, all living within a mile or so of each other. It's a very different quartet with a very different rhythm.
In Columbus, Ohio.
In Columbus, Ohio. You fast forward 5 years, that's when we started moving out of Ohio, but still playing in Ohio and performing in Ohio. The life, the world, the economy, the classical music scene, the recording industry. I mean, everything has changed between 2005 and 2019. CDs to streaming, then the pandemic. Well, yeah, we've been professional pivoters since we started, because we all started as members of a symphony orchestra, full-time members of a symphony orchestra. And this was our passion thing. And that shifted until we were none of us members of the orchestra, and we were doing the quartet full time, which shifted and we all moved. And so then it's to tackle one chunk of that at a time. Chaz, do you want to jump in? Finish my sentence.
Well, I'll shift to the last part of your question a little bit, Devin. So, the pandemic and what did it change? Well, of course, like everyone, we suddenly had to grapple with learning how to make, either recorded concerts or streaming concerts. And, like most smaller organizations, we can't hire people to do that for us. So we literally had to start buying some video cameras, get software, figure out how to hook up microphones, learn how to produce a nice quality video concert that people could enjoy. In our case, though, it actually led to something, and I should say that's even as we start seeing, a return of audiences. I think that aspect of doing more streaming, more recording, making your music available, I think that's going to continue. I think we all have that feeling. What impact that has when people can stay home still and watch things versus coming out to the concert hall, that's another story. But this also led to a more individual project. We had actually received a grant and were in the midst of planning for a live concert that was going to involve the application of interactive software, most likely through people's smartphones, to allow them to offer real-time feedback while the concert was occurring that would actually allow us to make instantaneous changes in what was happening in the program. So almost as though while we're playing, somebody could either say speed up or slow down, or we had this concept of trying to incorporate a kind of live, as I said, sort of in real time audience participation that directly and instantaneously affects the performance. And then the pandemic hit. And so Korine used the word pivot. We had to think of a way to turn this into an online digital project. And what we came up with is we've called the American Story. And this is an interactive video project where we wrote all the music, and the viewer who wants to listen and watch, because there's visual art to go with it, there's a story being told, and you have checkpoints through the story where you can make choices that direct the music as well as the art. It's kind of like choose your own adventure, basically, except that it's with all this music that the four of us wrote. It's all original music, and we performed, and then put together with this artwork to help tell the story. Because sometimes music, as much as it is a language, is a little abstract, perhaps to really keep a plot focused.
I might
So
just jump in with there. We call it American Story because it became even more relevant to the time. It was a story of how all of us and all of our parents and ancestors basically immigrated to the United States. And it traces each member's family history, and each member did the research on their family history and followed a family member and made different choice points. Like, this is what actually happened. These are the things that could have happened. And so we had the storyline, and then the potential offshoots, and then the branches from there, and the branches from the other. So it's a very complex thing. It was going to be really cool as a live performance, but I think it's also fascinating as an interactive video.
That's,
yeah,
I think.
and
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and we actually still, now that we're going back to live concerts, we still plan to develop this concert into a live audience experience. But the pandemic really forced us to take on the challenge of adapting it to a strictly digital format. But also, again, we had to figure out how to make it. So we learned a lot from it. And I think it came out pretty cool.
And that's one of the things I think is really cool about your quartet is you hear about, I mean, most quartets, they're playing other people's music. Going back to when Haydn and Mozart were writing, they would play their own quartets, and sit in the quartet. And one of the things I'm always curious is about that interaction between composer and performer. Can you talk about when you're actually the one who composed the piece and is sitting in the quartet playing?
It's very humbling, actually. You've got no one to blame but yourself for the things that make you mad. It's also thrilling to think of a piece and create a sound world in my imagination and write it for the people who I know are going to be playing it. It's a privilege. It's a rare thing. And then to be able to sit down and jump into the other side of my brain as a performer and have to kind of shut off the composer side and figure out what the heck did I just write here? Who is this crazy person that wrote this? But then to also listen to how, it exists in imagination only until the performers have it. And then you inject the human element of each individual person and their idiosyncrasies and their lived experience and how that informs the choices that they make, which combines into something far greater than anything I could have imagined. And I thought it sounded pretty good in my head, but it's a mind-blowing experience to step back and hear how it becomes something even greater in the hands of my colleagues. I'm humbled and floored and honored every time it happens. And also, again, as a performer, I always appreciate the feedback. I get honest feedback and clear feedback from my colleagues. And I think the more I write, the more I really appreciate the voice of the person I'm writing for, whether it's a violin, a cello, a singer, a clarinetist, a guitarist. I want my musical ideas to live in their voice. I don't want to foist like a cookie cutter Korine Fujiwara thing onto someone. I want my music to come alive as them so that they can make it their own. So that's for me, my experience.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add a tangent, which Devin, I'm sure you can appreciate, and you can also weigh in on, which is kind of a spin-off. our generation, the past generation, you know, it's become very, very important as musicians, as performers, and as interpreters. We're always talking about get a copy of the original score without editorial markings. Try to realize as closely as possible, try to adhere to a composer's markings and do as closely as you can what they say, right? And that is, of course, important. But kind of I've had kind of a little bit of a, I don't know, either a modification of that idea or I don't know if it's an insight. When I've written music and my quartet plays it, I realize that when you're playing it with fingers and bows and vibrating strings, and you're in a room that's so big, sometimes what you imagine with the best of your ability isn't quite right, and you have to change it. Now, I'm no great shakes as a composer, but then I think, well, why is it that when we get to the 20th century and we have examples of composers who performed their music, like Bartok notably, or conducted their music, I mean, Shostakovich, Walton, Britten, many others, why is it that we often find, if we're looking for it, if we're looking closely, we find discrepancies between what they wrote and what they did? And I think it's the same thing.
Yeah.
So, as important as it is to try to interpret a composer's intentions, I think knowing that when it's in real life, in a room, that sometimes things have to sometimes just be a little different because they feel different. I've come around to feeling like that's has more to legitimacy than I probably did when I was younger.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah.
also sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
The idea, like Chaz is saying, is how we take the ink on the page as the literal word that we must follow. It also humbles me as a composer, thinking, well, shoot, I'm usually sitting in my quartet saying, yeah, I forgot I didn't write a slur there. Could you put a slur there? And hey, I know I didn't put any dynamics there, but you know what I mean, right? Oh, you don't know what I mean? Okay. So it's taught me a lesson about, like, if people are going to be really, really literal, if I'm not there to say, hey, I'd like this soft, I actually do need to put careful edits. But on the same token, I don't want to put people in a box also, because that's that kind of magical place where you give enough information that there's this is the nucleus of an idea, but then I want your imagination to take it to the next level. I think that's an important part of the equation as a performer and as a composer, that you don't you want to get the idea there, but you don't want to take away the imagination of the performer.
Yeah, and we have a really good example. You both have experience, or you come to the string quartet from the orchestra field. Korine, you as a principal second, I believe you were principal second of the Columbus Symphony, and
Acting assistant principal.
acting assistant, and Charles, you obviously have played concertmaster, principal second, and you solo with orchestras all around the world, and you have this collaboration in the Storyteller, which is one of Korine's pieces based on Japanese folk tales, talking animals, magical creatures, and great battles with samurais and ogres that your father would talk to you about as a child. Can you kind of talk about, this was written for Charles, I assume. Can you talk about that collaboration between composer and violinist? We have, historical examples of Brahms and Joachim, giving advice to Brahms, which he never really much listened to, and Leopold Auer, who wouldn't play Tchaikovsky's violin concerto because he didn't listen to him. I would imagine your collaboration, you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff because you already are so intricately interwoven as your sort of familial connection, quartet wise. Can you talk about that relationship and the development of the Storyteller?
Jez, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy because for the most part, I just play whatever she writes, and unless it's just so impossible, I say, "Oh, please, 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 is there another solution to this?"
But the beautiful thing about it is he can play anything I write, which is kind of fun.
No. But yeah, no, it is nice. The thing is that in Korine's case, she's also, of course, such a great violinist and violist. So there is an advantage to someone who plays an instrument as well as she does. She already knows so well what she's writing and what can work, how it'll work, how it's possible. It's a little different, I think, when, for instance, Mendelssohn's first version of the violin concerto, and you look at the cadenza and there's almost nothing there. And then David obviously had a big hand in helping him sort of realize, all the arpeggiation and how that could fit. Because Mendelssohn almost just wrote out a chord sequence and almost nothing else. So in this case, I had the advantage of a composer who really, really understands the instrument.
I think from my perspective, it's very similar in that I know Chaz, I know his playing, I know his work ethic, and I know that he's very honest and brutally honest if he needs to be. It's very. It's a good working relationship. Writing it, I was doing a lot of imagining of these folk tales and trying to illustrate them in sound. I think the challenge sometimes is trying to figure out the balance between the instruments, between the groups of instruments. And in this case, this collaboration originally was going to be for a full orchestra, not just a string orchestra, but got a notification from the National Gallery. It was the National Gallery Orchestra. I think there was a government shutdown, or there was something in which the budget was changed, and I didn't want the piece to get canceled. So I said, how about what if we just make it strings? What if we make it strings? Then it can happen, right? Right. So yeah, all the woodwinds, all the brass, everything got cut down. So then
it was like a prelude to COVID or something like that.
Yeah, it was like practice pivot. Yeah. But I did change it. I had the first movement fleshed out differently, and was edited to make sure that it would go on, and with the hope that it could be done with a small string section, which the premiere was very small. I think it was a 3 or 4/4/3/2, maybe one bass, maybe two basses actually. Yeah. It was very small, and it has been performed with quite a large orchestra as well. And I think the collaboration is, sometimes there are things like, is this ending, do you like the way this ending goes? Jazz would say, maybe it should have a little bit more pow. And I'm like, okay, well, what do you mean about pow? How about this? Well, okay, how about that? Oh, okay, how about this? That's it. So it's a very open relationship with the idea of how can we make this even more effective as a piece.
I'll just interject, though. I realize I didn't really go from the beginning, which is how it came to be that I commissioned Korine to write the concerto in the first place. And basically, I had been thinking about, so I do play a lot of contemporary music. I have over the course of my life, and I love contemporary music. A lot of contemporary music is very beautiful. A lot of it is very challenging. But a lot of it is also not written with a kind of idiomatic idea of the instrument in mind. And I have to admit, maybe because from when I was a student, I have always had and still have a real soft spot for violin concertos that were written kind of for the violin. They have that element of really being written to take advantage of what the instrument can do. There's an element of virtuosity. There's an element of lyricism, two qualities that the violin is very well suited for. And Korine had written some solo violin caprices that I had played, and so I already had an idea of how she would tackle the idea of sort of virtuosic violin writing. And so when I had the opportunity to think about commissioning a concerto, in this particular case, I said, this time I do want to commission someone who will think about the violin and sort of how the violin works and sounds is a primary facet, not, and this, again, this is in no way a a slight to other contemporary works, but so many contemporary works, they're very much concerned with musical ideas and all kinds of things, and it just happens to be that they're played on a violin. Oftentimes, you almost have to invent new techniques just to play them in very extreme cases, right? You know, what we call extended techniques. We have to invent new ways of producing interesting sounds, and all of that is fine. But in this particular case, I really wanted a concerto that would be kind of a violin piece, and I think that's part of what Korine wrote. She wrote a very beautiful, compelling work, but it is definitely has elements where it feels like a violin concerto. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think that we can, if we circle back, or circle back is the wrong, if we move forward, the collaborative instance where I wrote for another piece that had been written for string quartet, but then it was fit for violin and piano. And that was very much a back and forth. It was a ballet written called Claudel. And Chaz had asked me to create a violin and piano version of it. And so I spent a lot of time trying to take 4 voices and turn it into 2 voices, but one as a violin and one as a piano. And, you know, I did study piano for a long time, but I haven't studied piano for longer at this point in my life. And so as I was writing it, I was sending my drafts to the wonderful pianist David Korovar, and he would give me feedback. He says, yeah, this is fine. This is fine. This is a little lumpy. Would you consider something like this? And then I said, yeah, but I really like this. What do you think about this? Oh, that's pretty good. How about that? But, you know, the essence of the music was never changed. It was just trying to put it into 10 fingers. And I think part of the challenge was also because it existed as a string piece first, and I hadn't imagined it on a keyboard. But the other part of it is, of course, I haven't practiced the piano for a number of decades. And so I couldn't sit down and say, oh, yeah, this will work just fine. I could say, well, if I put my fingers on the keys here, I know that I could reach this. But what I can do it at tempo, I couldn't do it at tempo if I tried, because I can't play the piano like that. So
So
that's
as a composer, you're not composing at the piano?
no, mostly I'm sitting and composing in my head and putting it in directly into finale,
Cool.
actually. Used to do it on paper. And then when I learned how to use notation software, I jumped right into that, because I really love the fact that when you finish something, you can create parts. You don't have to sit down and then write all the parts out by hand. And my handwriting, if I try, is almost legible. So I think it's a benefit to anybody who plays the music that I learned how to use finale.
Well, and speaking of writing for idiomatically for certain instruments, I'd like to ask about Reza Vali's music, which you have a lot of. CDs out there, particularly in his book of calligraphy. Reza Vali is an Iranian composer, and he focuses, and I'm sure you collaborated in this in some way, on the avaz, or the improvisatory style in Persian music. Can you talk about how you created or recreated this sense of improvisation in the music, and the DM system, which is like 2,000 years old, the Dastgah and the Magam system? Can you kind of talk about how you adapted that to the traditional string quartet idioms and nomenclature?
Um, we just work like hell with Reza. It's
It's
no, it's extremely hard. I mean, we just we practiced a lot, and we worked a lot with Reza. Um, as you mentioned, Devin, this is an old and complicated system of music, um, a musical system that, first of all, has different pitches than our Western notation, and of course, we just sort kind of refer to them under the heading of microtones.
Mm.
But unlike we're used to whole steps and half steps, and then with more contemporary music, we started having quarter steps.
Mm.
But we tend to think of these divisions as fairly equal, more or less equal divisions of the space. And of course, these Persian microtones are not even divisions. So an F quarter sharp is not where you think F quarter sharp will be even.
It's,
So I mean,
and it's not even F quarter sharp. It's like an F
no,
coron or an F sori or
right,
something like that. So
right, right. So there was just so many sessions of basically Reza saying, "No, Chaz, you're not playing the E caron correctly. It's not me, it's me." And
Wow.
it was I think um, the very first piece we learned with him was another very humbling experience, because all our lives we've been taught to put our fingers here, here, and here, and here, here, and here, and these are the 12 notes that exist. The only notes in the universe are these 12. And then suddenly it's like Horton hears a who. There's all these other notes that exist between the space where we thought there were no notes, and trying to figure out, like, okay, I don't know if I'm in tune. I have to learn how to know if I'm in tune. And then if I'm in tune, do I have the certainty of where that is so I can shift out of first position to that note on a different finger, like to develop the confidence of knowing that I'm in tune in a scale system that I haven't grown up with. It was a steep learning curve. And I mean, again, it shows me uh, what I don't know is always a good place. I don't know what I don't know, but I'm learning to tickle at that a little bit more. I think we all sat down and learning how to play in perfect fourths and perfect fifths in these microtonal systems. A lot of practice, a lot
the
of
other,
practice.
yeah, and the other aspect of his music that you mentioned is this sort of improvisatory tradition that he tries to capture, and what he does with that is it's pretty brilliant in a way. It's at first um, almost frustrating, because what he does is he writes in, just in traditional Western notation, an extremely complicated rhythmic complexity. He has groups of 7 with triplets nestled inside, all tied over to a group of 5, and other instruments are playing groups of 13
Hmm.
across this bar line. I mean, he basically makes the visual aspect of reading the music extremely complicated. And so at first you're not feeling improvisatory at all. What you're doing is you're it's like a puzzle, and you're trying to figure out where the heck these beats are and how to divide them and how they relate to the other voices. But when you finally work through that, you actually do start kind of reading past the notation, and you just start to get an understanding of this of a melody, which might be, in many cases, is followed in close canon by a second or a third voice, and it becomes a very free sounding and a very improvised sounding kind of performance. Um, and like I said, I think Reza knows full well how complex what he's written is, and I think he also knows that eventually, when you kind of get that internalized, what he gets then is the result that he's after, which is this kind of free, um, non-bar line, non even pulse, like not an evenly organized kind of rhythmic performance, which is what we're so used to in Western music.
Well, I think the Washington Post said it best about Carpe Diem with regards to music from Reza Vali all the way to Mendelssohn. They've never heard a performance by one of these multilingual quartets where the classical repertoire was delivered at a level on par with the finest traditional groups. Among contemporary quartets who speak in different tongues, the Carpe Diem is the best one out there. Can you talk a little bit about how playing the classics informs how you play new music, and then maybe a little bit about how you have and how you're currently developing audiences for new music?
Well, um, I think it's important to not just think about how the classical informs are other things, but how the other things inform our classical performance. I think everything you have influences from other countries showing up in classical music and nods and winks. Um, I feel like our exploration of the quartet repertoire, we love the standard classics, of course, and we're very curious about other things as well. And it's almost like if you think of it in culinary terms, if you only ate one style of food every day, only burgers and fries, only burgers and fries, and burgers and fries are great. They're awesome. But sometimes maybe you want chicken, and sometimes maybe you want sushi, and sometimes maybe you want some really spicy tikka masala. Sometimes you need to expand your horizons with that. And definitely musically curious, we're very musical curious folk and listen to many different things. And so I think if we're playing Beethoven, and Beethoven has a nod to Turkish culture, well, is it authentic? That's another thing. But we if we're playing something from Turkish culture, a Turkish music, then at least we know the frame in which he's trying to uh, emulate. And I feel like it's all interwoven that way. It makes us more interesting as performers, I think. Makes the um, whole experience a lot more fascinating. And I think that we choose things that we feel are authentic to who we are, and we've been curating this audience and this concert experience for such a long time. It's built on trust that you may never have ever heard of this composer before, but we think you're going to like it. Trust us, live with it for a little bit. And I think it's been working. I think it's been successful. um, we try to we want to make sure we play something that we can deliver, and feel that we're being honest musicians about it. And I think that's important, whether it's something that was written 300 years ago or something that was written yesterday. um, I think that's my take on it. Chaz, you probably have a lot to add on that.
You know, couple things spring to mind. One is that when you, I think in some respects, when you play a new piece of music that hasn't been heard before, um, naturally you feel a responsibility to play it um, as well as you can. But it also feels, I think, like in some cases a much freer kind of experience, because when you play Beethoven, you're aware of, first of all, oh my God, it's Beethoven, and it's been played by the Guarneri Quartet and the Emerson Quartet, and by the Juilliard Quartet and the Hagen Quartet, and like you have the weight of all the history of performances and all the things we know about Beethoven. It has to be so, and I think I don't know. I don't actually know if my colleagues all feel quite the same way about this, but I feel like you sometimes have a freshness and a freeness when you're playing a new work, simply to explore what you think it might be saying and how best to say that. And it's neat when you come back to a classical piece and think, I wonder if I could approach this with a little bit of that same freshness, not to be worried about uh, the fact that everyone has heard that classical piece 200 times before versus. So that's one thought. I don't know. I don't know if I expressed it well. The other thing, though, is that I think that as performers, we have an obligation to engage our audiences. And in particular, I think we have an obligation to rebuild trust um, in the kinds of experiences that they're going to have in a concert hall. And I know this is a huge oversimplification, but I think for quite a while there was a tendency for any serious classical performance group or performer to present only a very narrow swath of what was being written contemporary in contemporary music. It, to use some of my friends' words, we played a lot of really academic and thorny stuff. And the thing is, and we had choice as performers of what we performed. We didn't perform a lot of other music that is being written in our time. There's nothing wrong with thornier music. I sometimes love playing it, but I think to our audience, there actually became a perception that, or a feeling that, if they saw a contemporary work in a program, we better leave it at intermission before that's played.
That's why you play that work first at the beginning.
Or they just come late, park the car and walk slowly.
But of course, there's a lot of great music that is being written. And that's not by any means, that's only one small reason of why I think we play some of the different kinds of music that we do. But it's partly because, well, I'll put it to the way Korine has heard me tell this story. I had at one point in my life, and this I'll date myself by saying this was when I still had a cassette player in my car. And I would go home from rehearsal and I would put on some country western or some classic rock that I grew up with, or I would listen to the radio. I would listen to some jazz. I would listen to all kinds of music that wasn't classical. And I actually had that moment, I think, where either somebody asked me or the light bulb went off and I said, why is it that I listen to lots of music and enjoy it, but I don't allow myself to play any of it?
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of my personal turning point towards being more interested in many types of music, because it didn't make any sense. Why do I listen and enjoy, but I have some skill on this little wooden box, and yet with this, I can only play this narrow segment of music? Didn't make any sense to me. And that was kind of a pivot point.
I think to piggyback on that, all of that narrow kind of music, that narrow bandwidth, that it was new once also. And it was being supported and created for audiences who heard it the first time. And at some point, we traditionally got stuck in that era. And maybe I wouldn't pretend to know all the reasons why, but I feel like as performers, it's important to encourage music that's being written right now. Some of it people aren't going to like. Some of it people are going to love and then forget about. And some of it people might hate immediately and then love it later. And some of it people might love now and love later. But if we don't play it, then we're like a museum. We're like a relic. And living music and living musicians, it's important to nurture that, because otherwise we're just going to go the way of the dinosaurs. We've got so much interesting, diverse, fantastic, fascinating music that's being created all the time. And so if we don't try to investigate that, try to bring that in front of people, we're doing ourselves we're shortchanging ourselves and shortchanging our audiences and shortchanging the creators of music. I feel like it's kind of like a mutual responsibility, you know?
Well, every time I'm looking up, Chaz is playing new music that is very beautiful, including yours, Korine. So I'm very grateful for what you all are doing, and I look forward to following Carpe Diem. And before we go, I just have a really quick thing that I'm just starting, actually, called a lightning round, if you're up for it. And I'm just going to ask you some quick questions, and you can provide pretty quick. Don't take too long to answer them, because that's why it's called lightning.
Should we go back and forth so we don't talk in front of each other? Or?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. We'll start with Charles. Okay. What's one thing you do every day?
Practice fingered octaves. No, I'm not being truthful. One thing I do every day, I try to take a walk.
Nice.
I go geocaching.
Oh, sweet. Yeah. We can get into that in another episode, maybe a whole episode out of that. And then let's start with Korine. What is the last song you listened to?
Oh, it was something from the Juliet Letters by Elvis Costello.
Yeah, the slow movement of the Mozart K575
Oh,
quartet.
wow. Okay. And Charles, Spotify, Apple Music, or Amazon Music, or none of the above?
None of the above.
Okay.
Bandcamp.
Mostly.
Bandcamp. Nice. Congratulations. And then Korine, well, this is for both of you. You perform sitting down or standing up?
Standing up.
Standing up.
Nice. That's it. Well, thank you, Charles and Korine. And you have passed the first ever lightning round on one symphony.
Wow.
Thank you for joining, and I'm looking forward to collaborating with you both in the future and to see what Carpe Diem has in store next.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks,
It's
Devin.
nice chatting with you.